On April 1, 1945, Field Marshal Walter Model stood at the window of his headquarters in Ula and gazed out over a scene of utter ruin. Endless columns of exhausted troops, blackened tanks, and abandoned artillery. His desk telephone had been dead for 2 days, and contact with Berlin had been cut. The Allied noose was tightening around his formations. Some 300,000 German soldiers were trapped on a strip of ground, roughly 100 by 80 kilometers. Thus, the Ruhr pocket came into being, the largest encirclement of the Wehrmacht in Western Europe. In less than a fortnight, more than 317,000 men would surrender. Hitler denounced it as treachery. Historians later called it the point of no return. Model himself, unable to bear the shame of the greatest reverse of the German army in the West, would take his own life in a nearby forest 3 weeks later. How did the industrial heartland of Germany become a trap? Why did elite units capitulate without a last great battle? What must the soldiers have felt when the war's end ceased to be a hope and became a certainty? The Ruhr industrial area was the backbone of the German war effort. Between the Ruhr and Lippe rivers, this region produced roughly 65% of the Reich's coal and 80% of its steel, and it housed the largest chemical and heavy engineering works. Cities such as Essen, Dortmund, and Dusseldorf formed the foundation of Germany's war economy, a fact the Allies understood well. In March 1945, they launched a series of crippling raids codenamed Clarion. On the night of March 11th, over 1,000 bombers dropped nearly 5,000 tons of bombs on Essen. The factories were weakened but still functioning. Eisenhower realized that as long as that industrial tap continued to supply metal and munitions, the war would drag on. The plan that followed was ruthless and simple. Encircle the region, sever it from the rest of Germany, and force a surrender while avoiding protracted urban fighting. The mission was handed to Bradley's armies. On paper, German forces looked formidable. Army Group B, under Field Marshal Model, numbered roughly 430,000 men. The reality was bleaker. After the failure of the Ardennes offensive, the Wehrmacht never fully recovered divisions were under strength, depots half empty, fuel scarce. Inexperienced recruits were thrown into combat, while veterans, exhausted by years of war, grew fewer. On March 23, the Allies launched Operation Plunder, the Rhine crossing. Within a week, they had secured bridgeheads on the eastern bank and opened the path to envelop the Ruhr. On the morning of March 25, 1945, Lieutenant General Matthew Ridgway, commanding the 8th Airborne Corps, received orders to push east and link with the 1st U.S. Army coming from the south, closing the ring. To the north, General William H. Simpson's 9th Army had crossed the Rhine above Dusseldorf. Its strength at infantry and 2 armored divisions, more than 300,000 men, backed by roughly 2,500 tactical aircraft. German resistance was brittle. The 352nd Volksgrenadier Division mustered only about 4,200 men instead of its nominal 10,000. By the evening of March 26, the 9th Army spearheads had driven some 15 kilometers, and the speed astonished even seasoned officers. Captain James Collins of the 2nd Armored Division later recalled, "We moved as if on parade. The Germans fell back or surrendered in whole unit. Organized resistance hardly existed." From the south, the 1st Army, under General Courtney Hodges, pressed forward. Having crossed at Remagen, where U.S. forces had seized the Ludendorff Bridge on March 7, that bridgehead became a springboard for the On March 28, tanks of the 3rd Armored Division struck into Malberg, severing southern supply routes, and elements of the 9th Infantry Division followed, clearing scattered defenders. Allied troops captured depots holding some 50,000 tons of munitions. The Germans had neither time nor means to destroy. Model saw the danger. On March 27, he telegraphed Hitler asking permission to fall back across the Ruhr. The reply the next day ordered him to defend every meter to the last soldier, retreat forbidden. That command condemned hundreds of thousands of men. Model, a career officer since the First World War, knew that encirclement without fuel or air cover meant catastrophe. Yet he began organizing a circular defense because an order is an order. On March 30th, American tanks reached Paderborn, a key railway hub about 80 kilometers east of the Ruhr, and one of the fiercest battles of the campaign erupted there. A Panzer Grenadier formation raised in Westphalia, including tank school cadets and fanatic SS units, counterattacked fiercely. The fighting raged for 2 days. The Americans lost 22 Shermans and more than 100 men, but Allied superiority was overwhelming. On April 1st, Paderborn fell, and the path for the converging American armies lay open. April 1st, 1945, 16 o'clock, near Liptot, some 40 kilometers southeast of Pot. A symbolic meeting took place. A Sherman from the 3rd Armored Division of the 1st Army pulled up beside a vehicle from the 2nd Armored Division of the 9th Army. Their commanders climbed out and shook hands. The Ruhr pocket was closed. Inside were Army Group B under Field Marshal Model, parts of the 15th Army, remnants of armored and infantry formations, Volksgrenadier units, SS detachments, and auxiliary formations, about 430 German soldiers by U.S. estimates. The trapped area covered roughly 8,000 square kilometers, than Cyprus, but larger than Luxembourg, and contained industrial giants, such as Dortmund, Essen, Bochum, Gelsenkirchen, Krefeld, and Vup. Along with some 4 million civilians, Model set up headquarters at Schloss Schnellenberg, near Attendern, and convened his senior commanders. The atmosphere was grim. Lieutenant General Joseph Harp, commander of the 5th Panzer Army, reported fuel for 3 days, ammunition for a week of heavy fighting, and food that, under strict rationing, would last 10 days. Model asked bluntly whether a breakout was possible. Chief of Staff Major General Karl Wagener answered simply, no. The Allies dominated the skies and outnumbered them many times over. Any attempt to concentrate forces would be spotted and swept away by air attack. The Field Marshal decided to organize a defensive outer perimeter, turn cities into fortresses, conserve ammunition, and wait for relief or a reversal of fortune. It was an illusion, but he saw no other choice. The U.S. command proceeded with cold efficiency. Bradley split the objectives. The 1st Army would press from the south and west, while the 9th advanced from the north and east. The tactic was to divide the pocket into smaller sectors, isolate individual cities, and force garrisons to surrender separately. On April 2nd, intense artillery preparation began. Thousands of guns battered German positions, while aircraft struck roads and railways. In a single day, the Allies flew some 1,847 sorties over the Ruhr. Lancasters and B-17s worked day and night. German flak was often accurate, but shells were in desperately short supply. Hope inside the pocket evaporated. Corporal Helmut Altner of the 116th Panzer Division wrote in his diary, "We dug in on the outskirts of Bochum. The artillery never stops. The weight of bombs is endless. The sky belongs to them. Our planes are gone. Food is nearly finished. Officers order us to hold. But for what?" On April 3rd, American forces captured Hanover, cutting the last northern relief routes. That same day, the Red Army began its assault on Vienna. The Reich was shrinking on all sides, a contraction that was felt palpably in the Ruhr. On April 4th, the 79th U.S. Infantry Division approached Essen, the heart of heavy industry where the Krupp concern produced gun barrels, tank turrets, and even parts for submarines. Before the war, Essen had about 650,000 inhabitants. After the bombing, roughly 300,000 remained. Major General IRAW, who led the division, had expected stiff fighting, but intelligence reported the garrison numbered only about 5,000 men, mostly elderly reservists and teenage volunteers with outdated rifles and almost no ammunition. The struggle for Essen ran for days. Artillery systematically smashed defensive strongpoints, while infantry cleared block by block. Opposition was disjointed, isolated snipers, machine guns hidden in cellars, and the occasional armored counterstroke, but no coherent coordination. On April 7th, the mayor of Essen, Julius came to the Americans offering to hand over the city to spare the civilian population. The German commander, Colonel Kurt Pfizer, at first refused, but when American tanks rolled into the central square, he grasped the futility and signed the surrender. U.S. officers were shocked by the devastation. Major John Eisenhower, not related to the general, recorded that the city resembled a lunar plane. Intact buildings were rare. Factories lay in twisted piles of metal. People were starving in basements, and organized resistance had almost vanished. The populace simply wanted an end. Meanwhile, Allied forces pushed into Bochum, Dortmund, Gelsenkirchen, and Krefeld following the same script: heavy artillery preparation, air attacks, then tanks and infantry. Garrisons collapsed after days of pounding. On April 10th, Dortmund fell. Its defenders numbered roughly 3,200 against some 15,000 Americans, and the city commandant, Major General Erich Abraham, surrendered with his staff when Shermans arrived at the town hall. Gelsenkirchen and Krefeld proved harder. Remnants of the 116th Panzer Division, battle-hardened veterans from campaigns since 1940, turned every building into a firing post. The 35th U.S. Infantry Division fought to clear the city for 8 days. Daily casualties were relatively low, around a dozen men per day, but the strain was enormous. American officers noted German snipers fought until they exhausted their ammunition, accepting certain death rather than capture. On April 15th, resistance in Gelsenkirchen and Krefeld collapsed. 1,847 soldiers laid down arms, and roughly 400 lay dead. Among the prisoners was Lieutenant General Gard Mueller, who told interrogators simply that they had obeyed their orders to the end, and that whether they were shot or sent to a camp made no difference to him. By mid-April, life inside the pocket had become desperate. Food stocks were gone, and military police increasingly logged theft. 7 soldiers looted. In villages between towns, people hid their last crumbs, bricked up storerooms, buried sacks of flour, and concealed gardens. When Field Marshal Model ordered food requisitioned from civilians, outrage exploded. After years of bombing, many residents were already starving, and seizing their reserves meant condemning families to death. Some mayors refused and were promptly arrested. On April 18th, a revolt erupted in the village of Alta when peasants attacked a depot guarded by Wehrmacht troops. Shooting broke out, and 3 civilians and 1 soldier were killed. The next day, the Gestapo executed 5 local men as alleged saboteurs, though in truth they were farmers trying to survive. Desertion spread rapidly. Soldiers abandoned weapons, changed into civilian clothes, and hid in attics and cellars. Military police prowled the roads, checked papers, and publicly hanged deserters on poles with placards, branding them traitors. Roughly 200 men were executed in a single week, yet the flow of fugitives did not stop. Command structure frayed. Officers lost control. Communications failed. Daily radios ran on dead batteries. Telephone lines lay in ruins. Couriers were killed or surrendered, and headquarters no longer knew the real condition of their units. Reports reached command with hours or days of delay. If they came at all, on April 19th, the Allies shifted to mass psychological pressure. Aircraft fitted with loudspeakers circled the pocket, and millions of leaflets rained down 6 million in a single day, showing photographs of German prisoners eating, smoking, and smiling under captions that bluntly announced the war was lost and urged surrender to live. The leaflets blanketed roads, trenches, and rooftops. Wehrmacht men picked them up, hid them inside tunics, and read them by candlelight. Officers ordered their destruction, but the ban had no effect. The sheets passed hand to hand like a furtive promise. Loudspeakers broadcast in German. Berlin is encircled. Hitler hides in a bunker. Your families want you alive, not dead heroes. Surrender and you will get food, medical aid, and a chance to return home after the war. The psychological campaign worked. First Lieutenant Hans Schultz of the 3rd Panzergrenadier Division later recalled that after those messages, men began to ask why they were still fighting and what they were dying for. Talk of miracle weapons persuaded no one. Soldiers' faces betrayed only one desire: to survive. On April 20th, the Americans added a practical incentive by proclaiming safe corridors routes along which German troops could approach without being fired. ANAN airdropped maps marked with red arrows, pointing to US lines. That day near Hagen, the first small groups carrying white flags arrived. 37 men, then 64 more, and by nightfall over 200. Captain Robert Murphy remembered their exhaustion and relief. One surrendered in broken English: "Thank you for not shooting. For us, the war is over." Model tried to stem the tide of surrenders by ordering executions for anyone who spoke of capitulation, and by convening military tribunals that handed down hundreds of punishments for defeatism. But such reprisals only deepened soldiers' loathing of their commanders. Men realized they were trapped in being sacrificed to a pointless defense. On April 21st, Allied radio carried General Bradley's appeal to Model, warning that continued resistance would only bring more death to soldiers and civilians, and offering terms of honorable surrender with guarantees of life and treatment under the Geneva Conventions. Asking for an answer by noon on April 22nd, Model called a council that lasted 3 hours. Lieutenant General Harp argued that troops were starving and ammunition nearly exhausted, and that to fight on was a crime. SS Representative Obersturmführer Kurt Meyer retorted that surrender would be betrayal of the Führer, and that they were bound to fight on. Model said little he knew that in Berlin men had been executed for less, but he also knew the war was irretrievably lost, and found himself torn between a sense of duty and the certainty of catastrophe. On April 22nd, the Allies launched the final phase, shattering the pocket into small cells and denying the Germans any chance of coordinated defense. The First Army pushed from the south toward Hagen and Irland, while the 9th drove from the north toward Recklinghausen and Dins. German defenses collapsed. Divisions simply dissolved as men went home or surrendered. Of a supposed 8,400 in the 9th Panzer Division, barely over 2,000 remained. The 116th Panzer Grenadier was under half strength. Many formations existed only on paper. A vivid example came at Hagen. The 78th U.S. Infantry Division reached the city in the morning, and reconnaissance estimated up to 3,000 defenders. Major General Edwin Parker ordered an artillery preparation 48 howitzers. Opened fire, yet within an hour, a delegation emerged, bearing pleas to stop. The mayor, a Catholic priest, and 2 officers asked for the shelling to cease. The city commander, Colonel Willibald Borcht, was prepared to surrender to spare civilian lives on the single condition that his men be allowed to give up in an orderly, dignified way. Parker agreed. At 14 o'clock, some 2,847 German soldiers assembled in the central square, laid down their arms, and marched off in columns. Many wept, not from fear but from relief, and one NCO told an American interpreter that at last the nightmare was over and he would be able to see his wife and children again. Scenes like that occurred across the pocket. And on April 23rd, Irland surrendered without a fight. On April 24th, Recklinghausen was captured, followed by Dinslaken on the 25th. Most German officers realized that continuing the battle only delayed an unavoidable defeat. Still, not all agreed. In the town of Witten, around 400 SS troops from the 12th SS Panzer Division, mostly boys of 17 to 19, dug themselves in, convinced that victory was still possible. Their leader, Sturmbannführer Hugo Gross, ordered them to resist until death. The 95th U.S. Infantry Division attacked for 3 days, while the defenders used mines, snipers, and anti-tank weapons from house to house. The Americans responded with heavy shelling and bombing, reducing the town to rubble. When the fighting finally ended on April 26, only 18 Germans were captured. The rest were dead. Gross was found lifeless with a pistol in his hand, though no one could tell if he took his own life or was shot. By April 27, the Ruhr pocket had collapsed. Only isolated groups remained, separated and leaderless. Communication was gone, and each band decided on its own whether to surrender or fight. Almost all chose to live. On April 28, Field Marshal Model relocated what was left of his command to a forest near the town of Wind. It was no longer a true headquarters, but a few dozen exhausted officers, a handful of vehicles, and one useless radio. Model knew the end had come. That night, he called his remaining senior officers, Major General Karl Wagener, General Joseph Harp, and others for a final meeting. His words were short. He released them from their oaths, admitted the army group no longer existed, and told them the war was lost. Each man must decide surrender or attempt escape. Then he dismissed everyone except his aide, Oberleutnant Winrich Bohr, telling him quietly to go. Bauer remembered the last words. "Tell my wife I loved her. Tell my children to remember me as a soldier, not a traitor." Model took his Walther pistol, checked it, and placed it on the table. That night, he wrote 2 letters, one to his family, one to General Eisenhower, stating that while he could not personally surrender due to his oath to Hitler, he had ordered his men to give themselves up to prevent further loss of life, and asked that the prisoners be treated under the Geneva Convention. The next morning, April 29th, he walked into the woods with his pistol. 15 minutes later, a single shot was heard. His aide found him under a tree, dead from a gunshot wound to the head. He was buried by soldiers in an unmarked grave nearby. American troops later located and reburied him at the military cemetery in Wassenach, where he still lies. His death came to symbolize the fall of the Ruhr pocket. Once hailed as a master strategist who had stopped the Soviets at Heroism and Kursk, Model now faced the end of a doomed war and chose death over surrender. On April 30th, the Allies declared the Ruhr pocket destroyed. Only isolated resistance remained in basements and woods, and most holdouts gave up within a week. Counting the captives took time. American authorities created special registration camps where every prisoner was photographed, documented, and classified. Official records showed that between April 1st and 18th, 1945, roughly 317,000 German troops surrendered in the Ruhr. Among them were 24 generals, hundreds of senior officers, and tens of thousands of NC. Higher-ranking captives included Colonel General Gustav Adolf von Zengen, General Alfred Schlemm, Lieutenant General Gerhard Müller, and Major General Walter Dinhard. All surrendered peacefully, some even expressing relief. The Allies also seized enormous quantities of war material. Reports from General Bradley's staff listed hundreds of tanks, mostly Panzer IVs and Panthers, with a few Tigers along with over 1,000 self-propelled guns, thousands of artillery pieces, trucks, and ammunition stores. Yet most of it was useless. Vehicles lacked fuel, guns lacked shells, and many machines were broken beyond repair. Only about 15% of the captured weapons could still function. Around 10,000 German soldiers were killed, though the exact number is uncertain due to bodies buried in ruins. Nearly 15,000 wounded were treated by the Americans, while between 30 and 50,000 were listed as missing, mostly deserters hiding among civilians. Allied casualties were low, just over 200 killed, 8,000 wounded, and fewer than 500 missing. The loss ratio was roughly 1-4 in favor of the Allies, a result of their total air dominance, Germany's lack of supplies, and collapsed morale. Civilian suffering was immense. Around 6,000 people died in the battles and bombings. Thousands more were injured, and hundreds of thousands were left without homes. The Americans now faced the challenge of managing hundreds of thousands of prisoners. Existing camps were too small, forcing them to create temporary outdoor enclosures fenced with barbed wire. The largest was near Remagen, holding 86,000 men in a field of about 4 square kilometers. There were no barracks, only tents. Food came once a day: canned meat, hard bread, water. Sanitation was dreadful at first, with too few latrines and no proper facilities. Prisoners grimly nicknamed the place the Rhine Meadows. Illness spread fast: dysentery, pneumonia, exhaustion. In the first 2 weeks, about 1,200 died before conditions improved. After pressure from the Red Cross, supplies increased, medical aid arrived, and hygiene improved. Death rates dropped sharply to a few per day. When interrogated, prisoners gave similar answers to why they surrendered in such numbers. Corporal Klaus Weimer said they had no food or ammunition, and that even their officers no longer believed in victory. The leaflets promising food and safety convinced them to live. Sergeant Fritz Schmidt explained that after Model's death, all order vanished and surrender became the only choice. Lieutenant Helmutstein said he had seen the Eastern Front and the destruction of German cities and realized Continuing the fight only meant dying for a delusional leader hiding in a bunker. I chose to survive for the sake of my FAMILYUS. Army psychologists concluded that after the encirclement, Wehrmacht soldiers lost all belief in victory, in their leaders, and in Nazi ideology. Their only concern became staying alive and returning home. Promises of miracle weapons or a final triumph no longer carried weight. When Berlin learned of the mass surrender in the Ruhr, Hitler erupted in rage. On April 21st, at a conference in his bunker, he accused Field Marshal Model of treason. Colonel General Alfred Jodl, chief of OKW operations, tried to explain that it was not betrayal but an unavoidable military disaster. Hitler refused to hear it. He ordered Model to be found, tried by a military tribunal, and executed. A week later, when news of Model's suicide reached him, Hitler shouted, "Coward! A true German officer does not shoot himself. He fights to the end." This account later appeared in Jodl's post-war writings. The propaganda machine worked to hide the scale of defeat. On April 23rd, official bulletins spoke of heavy fighting, heroic resistance, and temporary setbacks in the Ruhr, with no mention of encirclement or surrender. Yet rumors spread fast. German citizens learned the truth from Allied broadcasts. BBC German-language programs reported that 317,000 soldiers had surrendered. The war was lost. Hitler was leading the nation to ruin, and surrender was the only way to survive. Millions listened secretly. Despite this, Joseph Goebbels attempted a counteroffensive in propaganda. On April 25th, he broadcast that the defeat in the West was temporary, that a new weapon was ready, and that victory would soon come. Yet even loyal followers no longer believed. Within the Wehrmacht, the Ruhr collapse sent shockwaves. Officers admitted that if hundreds of thousands surrendered without prolonged fighting, what would stop others from doing the same? Morale crumbled. Inspector General of the Army, Heinz Guderian, told Jodl that the Ruhr marked the beginning of the end and things would only worsen. On April 28th, Hitler authorized field tribunals with the power to execute immediately for desertion, surrender, or defeatism. Around 600 soldiers were executed in the following 10 days. But this did not halt mass capitulation. Men first surrendered in hundreds, then thousands. The Ruhr defeat sped the collapse of the German army. Previously, fear of Allied cruelty had restrained many, but now everyone saw that prisoners survived, were fed, and treated according to regulations. Fear gave way to hope. The Ruhr operation became a textbook example of encirclement warfare. Allied planners studied it closely as a model for trapping a large enemy force while minimizing their own casualties. Several factors made it effective. First, total air supremacy allowed the Allies to block German concentration and resupply efforts while constantly pressuring morale. Second, ground superiority and logistical strength meant the Americans had full supplies of ammunition, fuel, food, and reinforcements, while the Germans were critically short. Third, efficient logistics kept frontline units supplied, evacuated the wounded swiftly, and repaired equipment on site, maintaining rapid operational tempo. Fourth, deliberate psychological warfare, leaflets, broadcasts, and guarantees of humane treatment undermined resistance as effectively as artillery. Fifth, flawed German command decisions, particularly the ban on retreat, ensured Model obeyed futile orders. Lack of a realistic breakout plan, chaotic command, and depleted resources made defeat unavoidable. British historian Basil Littlehart called the Ruhr the perfect encirclement, a demonstration of speed, firepower, psychological pressure, and logistics used to destroy a large enemy force. Soviet commanders also analyzed it. Marshal Georgy Zhukov wrote that the operation exposed weaknesses in German Western defenses, while the Allies acted decisively, preferring encirclement and psychological collapse over frontal assaults typical of Soviet doctrine. For the Wehrmacht, the Ruhr symbolized collapse. Losing 317,000 men in weeks without serious resistance shattered the myth of invincibility. Soldiers and officers understood that even elite units could surrender en masse, making the slogan of fight to the end meaningless. Behind the numbers were human stories. Corporal Hans Kirschner, born 1922 in Bavaria, drafted in 1941, wounded in Russia, returned to the front in 1944, found himself trapped with the 3rd Panzergrenadier Division, surrendered near Essen on April 12, fell ill with pneumonia but survived, returned to farming in 1946, and never spoke of the war to his grandchildren. Dying in 1998, Lieutenant Werner Holt, born 1920 in Berlin to a professor, fluent in 3 languages, served in the 116th Panzer Division commanding a Panther platoon, lost his tank, survived with his crew, surrendered on April 18, taught English in the camp, worked post-war as a translator and teacher, published memoirs in 1962, and died in 1989. Sergeant Karl Weber, born 1918 in the Ruhr, a coal miner drafted in 1939, fought in Poland, France, and the Eastern Front, wounded 3 times, awarded Iron Cross twice, surrendered April 14 when supplies ran out, returned home in 1946 to rebuild mines, died 1982, SS Sturmbannführer Hans Kemmler, born 1915 in Munich, NSDAP member since 1933, fought fanatically with Hitler Youth, refused to surrender. Wounded and captured unconscious on April 16, attempted resistance in camp, sentenced to 15 years in 1946. Died 1953. Medic Friedrich Meyer, born 1925 in Hamburg, youngest of 4 brothers, 3 killed in war. Drafted 1943, served in field hospital, continued treating wounded after capture. Released 1945, became physician with Red Cross. Died 2011. Lieutenant General Joseph Harp, born 1887 in Prussia. Career officer since WWI, commanded 5th Panzer Army. Advised Model to surrender to save men. Surrendered April 21st. Released 1948. Wrote on German command errors. Died 1968. Private Ludwig Sch, born 1927 in Cologne. Drafted at 17, sent to Ruhr after only 3 weeks training. He never fired a single round. On April 2nd, the very first day of the encirclement, he gave himself up, alongside a group of boys no older than himself. The Americans were shocked. Soldiers, yes, but children as well. After the war, he completed his schooling and university and became a history teacher, telling his students, "War is not glory. It is fear, hunger, and death. I survived because I refused to play the fool for honor." Each of these accounts is a small part of the vast story of war, yet together they reveal its true face. 317,000 men were trapped in the Ruhr pocket. They were not just numbers. They were fathers, sons, brothers, and husbands. Some perished in camps, some returned home, some never forgave themselves for surrendering. And for others, it was the wisest choice they ever made. The loss of the Ruhr industrial region was catastrophic for the Third Reich. By April 1945, the area supplied roughly 60% of coal, half of pig iron, and up to 70% of steel, all critical to the war economy. After the encirclement and capture by the Allies, production ceased almost entirely. On April 15, Minister of Armaments Albert Speer sent Hitler a report warning that the loss made further war efforts impossible. Ammunition output would drop 80% in a month, and repairs for tanks and aircraft would be unachievable, leaving the army without means to fight. Hitler dismissed it, still clinging to dreams of miracle weapons and fanatical resolve. Reality, however, was relentless. By April 20th, tank production had dropped from 300 per month to around 40, aircraft from 1,200 to 150, and artillery shells from 2 million per month to 200,000. Troops relied on remaining depot reserves, which dwindled quickly. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army began its final assault on Berlin on April 16. German units fought desperately but constantly faced shortages of fuel and shells. Artillery fired sparingly. Tanks ran out of gasoline, and infantry held only with small arms. The loss of the Ruhr was felt across all sectors. In the West, American and British forces advanced with little serious opposition. After the Ruhr pocket fell, the way into Germany's heartland was open. On April 25, American and Soviet units met at the Elbe near Torgau, cutting Germany in two. The end seemed inevitable. Civilians sank into resignation. Propaganda had lost its power. Rumors of mass surrender in the Ruhr, of Field Marshal Model's suicide, and of Allied advances confirmed what everyone already knew. The war was over. People hid in cellars, prayed, and waited. The German economy collapsed. Destroyed bridges and rail junctions paralyzed transport. Food supplies failed, and hunger consumed cities. Black markets thrived, prices soared. A kilogram of bread cost hundreds of Reichsmarks, while a worker earned only 200 per month. On April 30th, Hitler killed himself in Berlin. The city surrendered on May 2nd. On May 7th, Colonel General Alfred Jodl signed Germany's unconditional surrender. And on May 8th, the war in Europe officially ended. The so-called Thousand-Year Reich lasted just over 12 years. The Ruhr disaster was among the final decisive blows. The 317,000 soldiers who surrendered in weeks demonstrated that the army no longer believed, no longer wanted, and no longer could fight. When men collectively choose survival over hopeless combat, the war is irretrievably lost. 8 decades have passed since those April days of 1945. The cities of the Ruhr are rebuilt. Factories operate, and ordinary life continues. It is hard to imagine one of the 20th century's greatest military catastrophes occurred here, yet memory persists in museums, memorials, archives, and survivor accounts. The Ruhr pocket reflected collapsing illusions. Nazi propaganda had claimed the German soldier was invincible, the army unbeatable, and Hitler a guide to greatness. Reality said otherwise. Ideology does not provide food. Patriotism cannot stop tanks. Fanaticism does not produce ammunition. Allied commanders learned that modern war relies on logistics, morale, and psychology. One can have powerful weapons yet lose through human exhaustion. One can outnumber the enemy but squander advantage through poor strategy. Victory in the Ruhr was achieved as much by intellect as by force. For German soldiers, the pocket left lifelong scars. For some, surrender meant shame and betrayal. For others, it was salvation and the only chance to see their families. Some believed only in survival. War destroyed millions, and the Ruhr was another weight in that destruction. Field Marshal Walter Model remains a complex figure, a skilled commander who also executed orders from a criminal regime, sending men to die senselessly. Was his suicide an act of honor or an escape from responsibility? Historians debate, but the fact remains, he could not accept the truth. The war was lost, and continuing it would have been criminal toward his own troops. What remains from those days are numbers and books, documents and archives, photos of ruins and columns of prisoners, and a lesson. Any war fought for a dictator's ambition ends in disaster. Any ideology placing abstraction above human life is doomed. Any army lacking moral cohesion collapses. The Ruhr pocket revealed the final reality of the Reich. Hunger, chaos, desertion, surrender all that propaganda hid. Soldiers no longer trusted promises. Officers lost control. The system failed under its own weight. When the end arrived, it was swift and merciless. In today's era of new conflicts, the Ruhr experience remains relevant. It shows that war is not a parade or medals, but death and ruin. Victory favors not the strongest on paper, but the best organized, supported, and morally grounded. The 317,000 soldiers in the Ruhr made the rational choice. They chose life. They returned home rather than die heroically for madness. History does not condemn them. It reminds us that true courage sometimes lies in recognizing defeat and saving the living. Europe's war ended May 8, 1945, but consequences lingered. Millions dead, cities destroyed, families torn apart, generations scarred. The Ruhr is but one episode of this tragedy, yet a telling one. Empires built on violence and lies are doomed. The higher they rise, the harder they fall. A month after the Ruhr surrender, Europe finally knew silence. Germany lay in ruins. Millions of prisoners awaited repatriation. Civilians searched for the missing. Refugees returned where possible. Reconstruction and reconciliation began, with hope it would not repeat. Have we learned? Wars continue. Dictators emerge. Propaganda deceives. But the Ruhr teaches that reality prevails. Soldiers refuse to die for another's ambition. People declare life worth more than dogma. On April 18, 1945, in some parts of the Ruhr, silence fell for the first time in years. No explosions, no gunfire. People emerged from cellars, looked at the sun, and wept in relief. Hunger, cold, and uncertainty lay ahead, but life remained. The Ruhr pocket's memory survives not for glory or blame, but as a warning. War's cost is immense, life fragile, reason stronger than fanaticism. 317,000 chose life and endured. Thousands chose death. History records the truth. When faced with senseless death or survival, the answer is clear. The Ruhr pocket closed in April 1945. Yet its lessons echo. Recognize lies before disaster. Summon courage to reject madness. Future generations will seek answers. But the lesson is already clear. True victory is peace, life above ideology, reason over fanaticism. That is the enduring meaning of the Ruhr.